I want to begin with the Freedom House report, which you should look at, of 2015. Now, I historically I've been aware of the work that Freedom House does, but often been critical about the criteria that it uses at times in their assessment. But I must say, post-Sisi, Freedom House is spot on, whether they're talking about Egypt or they're talking about the Tunisian situation. And by way of introduction, what they wind up saying when you look at them, they say, in terms of the trajectory of democracy, by the late 1990s, there was significant global shift to electoral democracies. But that in the first years of the 21st century, there was a reduction in democratic freedoms. And in their 2015 report, they say that for the 9th consecutive year, the condition of global politics and civil liberties showed an overall decline. Indeed, acceptance of democracy as the world's dominant form of government and an international system built on democratic ideals is under greater threat than at any point in 25 years. This afternoon, I will tell you their comment with regard to the situation in Egypt, which, in light of those comments, basically, Egypt becomes a quintessential example of how bad things really are, okay? So that's by way of background as we come into this. It seems to me, and two colleagues and I have just finished a book which just went to Oxford last week. It began with the word Arab Spring, and so of course we had to rewrite it for the last 2 years, and then just decided, who cares? You know, I'm not going to live to be 100, so we can't keep revising this stuff. But we talk about the fact that one has to have a different view of where we are and where the 21st century is going. And I would just say that with regard to Professor Haynes' comments at the beginning of his talk, when he talked about the fact that we need to use language, but in fact, often we don't really use the words in the same way and hear them in the same way. I would say most of the words are on the table now, including secularism, democracy, Islamism, political Islam, and we need to sort of rethink that, and I'll refer a bit to it. The question is democracy today, is it in trouble or dead? Are we entering a next round of global terrorism, symbolized by ISIS? The Obama administration is looking to, in effect, and I'm not just singling out my own country here, to declare war on ISIS for the next 3 years. And there's a lot of talk about and framing of dealing with ISIS in terms of a global war, which I think is a bit exaggerated. You start using that language, it comes back to bite you. Or are we currently in a stalled stage in an inevitable process of democratization in the 21st century? In other words, there are reversals, okay? We're in a stalled stage, it is a kind of winter, but do we see not only the possible for change down the line, but that it's probably going to be inevitable. It may take a long time for a variety of reasons, which I'll get to. Just very briefly, because everybody has referred to it, I think it's important again to note that when the uprisings took place, everybody was shocked, including many who initially went into the street, that they really were effective and the governments were toppled. And the level of that, I think, then led to the kind of euphoria, on the one hand, of those who had great expectations that somehow there was going to be this, tsunami wave of democracy across the region. On the other hand, that then led to the really incredible fear and threat that came from many governments in the Arab world, particularly the Gulf governments. Not so much that somehow the Brotherhood or Ennahda were going to come into their region, but that the example would then ignite. And you could see that in the way in which, in some countries, things were handled the way they always are. Have a crisis, raise the salaries, etc. I wish we had a little bit of that in the U.S. I mean, it would be good for the economy vis-a-vis the government. But in other words, you throw money at it to make it better. Of course, the problem is the money got thrown far beyond the borders, of the Gulf, and in support of things like the Egyptian coup. Which of course is not a coup, according to some governments. Now, if we look And think about this, we held in Istanbul after this, we meaning my center / Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, Georgetown, and a think tank in Turkey. We held a meeting in Istanbul right after it. We had activists, Islamic, secular, etc., from Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Libya. However different they were in their perception of things, etc., they agreed on two major concerns and problems. One was the deep state. As one of them said, you know, when you had the French and American Revolution, the others were either killed, imprisoned, you know, fled the country, but in fact, we have the reality of dealing with an entrenched bureaucracy, military, court system, of security, and you know, what will that mean in terms of our reaching? And the other was, of course, the question of the double standard. Now, 2015 comes, the tide turns, and we see what looks like almost the breakup in the Middle East and the concern about where do we go from here. We see a restoration of authoritarianism in Egypt, but we also see the danger of a restoration, a greater authoritarianism, not only occurring within the Gulf itself, that is against opposition movements and any opposition that is Islamist, but also the export of that attitude, and people were talking about that. You know, not just the declaring, let's say, of, not just, but, you know, a single movement as terrorist, but in effect saying, all of these groups ultimately are affiliates. And here's where we get into the problem when we use a word like Islamist historically. We don't distinguish between those that function in mainstream society, you know, and those that are extremist. Instead, we buy into the logic of authoritarian regimes all along, that those that seem to function in society are wolves, you know, in sheep's clothing. And of course, then the danger is Western governments buy into that. And so what we see also is that a conventional wisdom that looked refuted by the uprisings, that is, that, you know, that in fact the majorities really, because the politics or culture didn't want democracy, or that security was based on stability, therefore we just support the authoritarian regimes. Well, then it looked like over time the US and the EU were, you know, they had to deal with that and were adjusting to it. But now we're back into a situation where it's as if we go back to that old model, and in fact, one of the things that's kind of noticeable is in certain areas, some countries, some European countries, certainly the UK, and also the US, look like they're actually getting closer to some of their allies that are problems. And that, of course, sends also the wrong signal, both within the region as well as outside, and also the danger is that it can exacerbate greater radicalization, which again I will talk about later. I think the two cases of Egypt and Tunisia are interesting. You didn't give this to me yet, so I haven't seen the 2 minutes.
Okay.
The two cases, and so I'm going to take 3 minutes on this. Just compare them for a second. The Egyptian situation lays out, in many ways, in the best possible way, what the problem is. That is, it's right out front. You've got the restoration of authoritarianism. It's not done subtle. You've got clearly the support for that revolution and the continued financial support, okay, by outside donors, as it were. And no one would debate that. Well, not no one, but it's fairly out there in terms of empirical, you know, evidence, okay? And the way in which that government then shows itself in terms of, initially, the signal is we'll have an inclusive political system after the coup, you know, where we're going to bring about, you know, stability and security and democracy somehow. But then the Brotherhood suddenly becomes a terrorist organization, okay? And then you have massacres, repression, which of course, in general, quote, the civilized world says, you know, we're not happy with that. Rather than elements in the civilized world condemning it clearly and using words not of criticism but condemnation, and demonstrating that by also making it very clear that issues like support and aid, you know, will be withheld. It's become full-blown now because even those that supported the regime but now want to speak out, they're also thrown into prison. So you have, you know, trials, you have mass death sentences, you now have a group of people who simply for being critical of the government, you know, more than 225, you know, found guilty with a long term. That's out there and it's clear. I'm glad you put please. I will finish. The Tunisian example, though, is the more subtle and I think, instructive. In contrast to the Muslim Brotherhood, Ennahda, I believe, was far more savvy. Of course, the situations were different in the country. The military in Tunisia didn't act, but more politically savvy. The vision of Ghannouchi in terms of talking about civil Islam. The emphasis on national unity to the point where Ennahda backed out of government, okay? And even what, in fact, most would argue politically they shouldn't have done, but Ghannouchi pushing to get Ennahda on board, and that is to allow members of the former government and the RCD to run, to run for office in the current conditions, rather than say, for example, they're going to run for 5 years. But the real question now, and the real test is, will the winners who have now taken all, parliament, the presidency, will they prove that they're really inclusive? Not just with a little window dressing. So, for example, initially 24 ministerial positions, nothing to Ennahda. Now you get a couple of seats given to it, okay? If Morsi had done that, or Ennahda had done that, and Ennahda, remember, had that inclusive approach to all, people would have said that's window dressing. So I think that a real challenge to elites, not only in Tunisia, but elites in other parts, who is going to be, are you really liberal Democrats who then will work with others in the name of national unity? Okay, that's it.
Thank you very much, Professor. I will apologize in advance. I will be rushing everyone. There is a lot to say on this issue, but we are working towards a tight schedule.
I'll be glad to pass the time limit to him.
Well, you passed your time limit, by the way.
No, I'm going to take. You should take away a couple of minutes from him.
You are wasting our time.
Okay. Next to speak is Professor Abdelwahhab ElAffendi. He's a political scientist who specializes on the subject related to Islam and modernity. And he's a reader in politics at the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster. So I'll hand over to Dr. Abdelwahhab.
Thank you. I'm now seeing that you have treated my friend John that way. I'm going to just give small points. I'll start with a small reflection about the date today, because today is the 12th of February, which when I was thinking that the message Cordoba want to send that they commemorating the assassination of Hassan al-Banna, which is today. But I thought again yesterday also was the Iranian Revolution. So I don't know what the message, but the day before was my birthday. So I think that the message I'm sending, that disaster is coming in very quick succession.
That'll be in the Telegraph this weekend, by the way. Those comments will be in the Telegraph this weekend.
But I think that the first point about Islamists and democracy, or Islamists and democracy, is that at the moment, Islamists have become Democrats in spite of themselves. Because everybody now is associating the struggle for democracy with in the Arab world with Islamists, or imposing it on Islamists. Whether these the regimes in Egypt or the regimes in Syria, who accuse all their enemies, or anybody who agitates for democracy, that he is an Islamist. So it doesn't matter now. If you are a Democrat, you are an Islamist, and if you are an Islamist, you are also opposed to the dictatorship. So that might be a good thing, I think. That now Islamists have to know that their faith and democracy are tied together. Also, I think some of the dictatorships in the Arab world and also outside the Arab world. I mean, yesterday or the day before, Sisi was hosting Putin. So a new axis of evil of all enemies of democracy is forming. And they see all of them, they agree that Islamists are the threat, because they seem to be the ones who have the ability to change and to challenge dictatorship. So that, I think, is something which is now happened, and it should be reflected on by the Islamists, in the sense that they should translate this into a more clear and unequivocal commitment to democracy and democratization. The second point, I think, we always have to look at the context. The the actors in this game are not the Islamists alone. They are the states, they are the international community. But if we look, for example, if you want to look at empirical evidence, I am really, of course, shocked and saddened that our friend John and me and everybody else here, Anwar Ibrahim, has been unjustly convicted in Malaysia this Tuesday. Again, it's happened to be on my birthday as well. And but Malaysia, whatever we say about it, Malaysia is one of 3 countries in the Muslim world. The other is Kuwait, and the third is Jordan, where there have been some level of democratic stability, mild authoritarianism, but still openness, democracy. There was no coups, there was continuity throughout their history, from independence until today. What is common to these 3 countries? In all of them, Islamists have always been legitimate and part of the system. So there has been also a contextual, historical connection between stability, democratization, and the role of Islamists. Whenever you have Islamists have a role in openly, you have stability and you have some kind of openness. So it is not that the propositions and the ideas of Islamists are not, or their reaction or the way they move towards the political context is also dictated by the political context itself. So if there is a country which arrests and tortures and persecutes Islamists, who, as I said earlier, because they are the only ones who are seen as the challenge to the dictatorship, then that country would have lots of problems, of which lack of democracy is one. The fourth point is that we also need some updating of how it started here. Some updating on our conception and also on Islamist thinking, because a lot of the literature, a lot of discussion, for example, they start with Hassan al-Banna, and for example, what was Hassan al-Banna or Mawdudi's attitude to democracy? Now, at that time, in the 30s and the 40s, when Hassan al-Banna was active, everybody's attitude to democracy was different from what it was today. And so we cannot just go back to that. And I think also for the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamists themselves, they have to update their thinking, because I follow the Ikhwan literature, and I was sent a few months, 2 or 3 months back, an article, which again was authored in 2011 by a senior member of the Brotherhood trying to explain the ideology of Muslim Brotherhood. I read through that article, and I noticed that almost every reference in that piece dates either from 1940s or 1930s, with a couple from the 1950s. I said, where are we living? Are we living in that time, or have we moved on? We have really to move on. I'm going to finish now because this person who is the moderator is actually ruining our...
You've got 4 more minutes. I can continue for 4 more minutes.
I think we should not waste time preparing for these things. If you give us 10 minutes, we just come and chatter and then go. But I'll point to a number of reflection conversation, because like John, we had been engaged and John with me, and we have been engaged in a long time with debate on both sides of the argument between Islamists, secularists, and also Western diplomats. So somebody else is also. Sorry. Now in 2008, we had organized a conference at CSD here, and the title at that time was Islamists and the Hamas Challenge. And the point we're discussing was not about Hamas and violence, but was about the way Hamas has come to power without expecting it or knowing it or wanting it. In 2006, they ran for the election and suddenly won the election. Now, everybody knows that Hamas didn't want that, because if you become a prime minister in the so-called Palestinian Authority, you have to deal with Israel, and you have to be actually do the job of Israel of keeping the Palestinians quiet. And that's not the job which Hamas wanted. But then they didn't think ahead about what do you do if you get elected. And we had all these members of the Muslim Brotherhood, Katatni, Ghanouchi, and everybody, and from Libya, and said, all right, can you tell us what will you do if you get elected without wanting it? And at that time, all of them didn't seem to think that they'll be elected. And people like Ghanouchi, of course, rightly at that time said, I mean, we can't even get into our country. How can you ask us to think about getting elected and things like that? But I said, all right, humorous, think ahead. Because it happened to Hamas, why don't you think ahead? And I think this is probably one of the main problems of Islamists. Not that they don't know how what democracy is, or they don't want democracy. They are not bold enough. They do not think, all right, we're going to rule. Let us think of a kind of policy to do when we rule. So they walked into, with Hamas, they walked into government without thinking. In Egypt, they also, until January, the Mursid was saying we will never field the presidential candidate, because as he said at that time, we will be like Hamas in the sense, in a different lesson. We will be under siege. And of course, that I think, as I said at the time, and I say now, is the wrong lesson. Because Egypt is not Gaza. You cannot be under siege, but you need to be president for all the Egyptians, and you need to think ahead, and you need to make the balances. If you want to run a country, do like Erdogan in Turkey. You have to deal with the military, you have to deal with NATO, you have to deal in Egypt. If you want to rule Egypt, you have to accept Camp David Agreement, you have to deal with Israel, you have to deal with Americans, you have to deal with... They were never thinking ahead. I think this is the problem. The problem is not between Islamists and democracies, but Islamists and governance. How, as an Islamist party, since whether you like it or not, you are now the main opposition, the main political group, you are the main democratic movement, you have to think more broadly about governance. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for finishing on time, and privilege in introducing our next speaker, Professor Jeffery Haynes. He used to be one of my lecturers at university. He is an Associate Dean in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities in London Metropolitan University, and he directs the University Centre for Study of Religion. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Haynes.
Thank you very much, and I shall try and follow the path of righteousness here and stick to 10 minutes, but hey, you know, no, I shall. I'm a well-trained social scientist from London. Thank you very much for the invitation again. Thank you very much. One good thing about coming last in a panel, of course, is you can steal all the ideas from the earlier speakers, so I shall do that fulsomely right now. My other interest is in democratization. I co-edit a journal called Democratization, which has been around since 1992, actually. It's in 1993. It's in its 22nd year of publication. And it came about in the aftermath of what's known as the third wave of democracy. And Professor Esposito mentioned in passing he referred to the Freedom House statistics over time. And one thing we can see empirically is that around the world there are more and more countries that can justifiably call themselves democracies. We've also seen, however, a qualification of that term democracy. So we used to think we'd go from authoritarianism or even totalitarianism to something called democracy, where we would have a phase of democratization. We would then come to a period of democratic consolidation, where implicitly countries would adopt liberal democratic values, frameworks of doing politics, and the world would increasingly look like a homogeneous democratic space. One thing that we've seen in the journal over the last 20-odd years is that that isn't in fact the case, that something called democracy isn't at the end result of something called democratization. So if we think that there is a polarization between something called democracy and something called non-democracy, then I'm afraid we're living in a view which doesn't reflect the realities in the world. In other words, there are very few countries that have all the characteristics, as most of us will identify them as, of a democracy. Let me give you an example. Earlier on, the reference was made to Turkey. And Turkey is often highlighted as one of the success stories of the Muslim world because for the last 13 years, the AK Party, the Justice and Development Party, has been in power, and it's won considerable percentages of the popular vote. The last election, the most recent election, it got nearly 50% of the popular vote. Now, in one measurement, that's a democratic success story because Turkey's ballot box politics are relatively clean, they're relatively unaffected by the military, say, which used to be a major player in Turkish politics. Yet, Turkey in the Freedom House ratings, the Freedom House league table, is declining in terms of its democratic characteristics. Not because it has elections which are not particularly good, but because the context of those elections are increasingly undemocratic. It's a pity the speaker defending the AK Party government isn't here now, because one thing which the AK Party government is very well renowned for is locking up journalists whose view of the world is different from the ruling elite. Now, that may not matter. You say, well, look, this is democratic. This is about democracy. This is about the ballot box, and therefore that's paramount. But I think the bigger issue is that when we talk about democracy, we can't simply begin and end with elections. And of course, the last 2 or 3 decades, the European Union, the United States of America in particular, has implicitly championed the idea that democracy begins and ends with the ballot box. You have the ballot box, you have a free and fair election, the outcome is democracy, let's carry on, this is a success. But as we've seen in many countries around the world, not just Turkey, but a whole range of countries with a whole range of political cultures, religions, traditions and histories, that's the start of a process of democracy, not the end of it. And one lesson, if I can use this terrible cliche, one lesson which we can see from the Western experience is that democracy is a very hard-won prize which takes many, many decades in most cases to reach fruition. So the process of something called democratization in Western Europe, one could trace back in many countries to the 19th or even the 18th century. Democracy takes a long time to learn. And what democracy is about the willingness to tolerate views that you're not happy with. This notion that I abhor your views, but I will die for your right to express them. And this is the difficulty of 5 whole minutes. Thank you so much.
He's favoring you.
He is. Well, clearly, he's a former student of mine, so, you know. Way to go, as I believe the Americans say. And you know, it's a question that even in the bastions of democracy, the United States, let's say Britain, let's say France, the sort of the card-carrying key members of the democratic club, this relationship between political outcomes and democratic values is by no means a given. It's by no means something which emerges spontaneously just because we have elections. The reason I'm using all this as a framework for the question that we're looking at today about Islamist perceptions of democracy and the state is that it would be fanciful to think that just because someone gets into power by the ballot box in a political environment which does not have a democratic tradition, it would be fanciful to think that democracy would simply flow. Because periods of authoritarianism are often about winners and losers. It's a zero-sum game between those in power and those out of power. And, you know, none of us are perfect. If we've been on the receiving end of draconian policies which have undermined us, which have treated us badly, it's almost human nature that when one gets power, one is resentful of those who formerly put us under a difficult regime. It's not ideal, but I think democratization, and what we've seen in the rest of the world about this really, in this third wave of democracy, whether we look at Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South and East Asia, the former Soviet Union, the key acid test about democratic success or failure is to what extent can we tolerate views, can we live with views that we don't agree with. So it's very difficult indeed to move from a position of authoritarianism to a position of democratization in the sense that I'm referring to. In many ways, I suspect that the label political Islam and Islamist is rather a red herring when we look at this issue in relation to the Middle East. A country which is rarely mentioned in terms of democratic success stories in the Muslim world, relatively unusual to hear about it, is Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, 200 plus people, which has been a democracy since 1998. Now, it's worth thinking about this because when we tend to think about democratization failures in the Middle East, we tend to almost intuitively say, this is the Muslim world, this block of 20 countries is the Muslim world. But of course, the Organization of the Islamic Conference comprises 57 countries, which either have a Muslim majority or a highly significant Muslim minority. The Arab world, therefore, is not the Muslim world. So one could say, I would argue that it's nothing really to do explicitly with the dimensions of political Islam, making democracy achievable or not achievable. Because countries like Indonesia, or maybe India with its 150 million Muslims, which has been a democracy for the most part since 1947. And those Muslims have had no problem living in a democratic framework over those 6 or 7 decades. It's not so much political Islam which is a drawback to democracy or an encouragement to democracy. My strong sense in the Middle East and North Africa is that we're talking about a political culture created and maintained by issues which are not to do with Islam. They're to do with authoritarian rule. They're to do with the zero-sum game of politics and the unwillingness of those with power to give up that power. Now, this is hardly revelatory. Political elites don't like losing power. They don't like losing power anywhere. But in countries that have democratic credentials which are demonstrable, the political elites are still necessarily lose power when the popular will demands it. Yet if those political elites could not lose power as a result of the popular will, I'm fairly sure that in some cases at least that is what would occur. So I think that what we're talking about primarily in the Middle East and North Africa is not a deficiency of political Islam. It's not that democracy and political Islam are not compatible, because all the evidence that I'm aware of is that Islam and democracy are perfectly compatible. But where we've seen in the Middle East and North Africa significant disappointments in terms of the Arab Spring outcomes, my judgment is that this is much more to do with the traditions, the history, the world position of such countries in a longer perspective than simply a snapshot of democracy or not in 2015. It doesn't make the future any easier, it isn't the case, for example, that in Syria, Assad is suddenly going to stand down and we'll have a pristine democratic environment where everyone will work in a position of tolerance and compromise through the ballot box to come up with a new Syria. Of course not. So there is a lot of questions to ask. Please finish. I will. There's a lot of questions to ask about the relationship of political Islam to democracy, but there's lots of questions to ask about democratic outcomes much more generally, not just in the Middle East and North Africa, but around the world, where we've seen something like a shift to something like democracy, which has stalled over the last 15 years. One could even argue that there is a democratic backsliding, a real authoritarianism of many political environments that we thought had become democratic. Now, none of this answers the question that I'm asked to look at, but I think it does at least make some of the issues in a wider context than perhaps if we simply focus explicitly and only on the characteristics of the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Haynes, for not indulging my favoritism too much. I've been strictly advised to finish at 1:20, so we only have 15 minutes, which probably gives us 2 rounds of questions. So what we'll do is take 2 rounds of questions, 3 at a time, and get the experts to answer and then move forward from there. So, gentleman here.
My name is Ahmed. I'm a Master Student at King's College. And actually, my interest in this session was about, the title of the session was about the perception of Islamists about the rule of the state and the democracy. And I wonder if I'm afraid that I'm still unable to get the idea from the panel. If someone can elaborate, what are the perceptions, different perceptions of Islamists toward the state? What are the interests of the state that Islamists think that they should guard and they should work forward to achieve it? Is it the religion? Is it the national interest? Is it the economic success? So this is my question.
Hello, Jenny Tong, member of the House of Lords. This is probably a slightly naive question, and I apologise, but none of you have mentioned the rule of law. And any democracy anywhere in the world should, I thought, first establish the rule of law. And I want to know what you think are the difficulties with establishing a rule of law in a democracy when Sharia is so strong.
There's a gentleman over there. That's it.
Hello, Ashur Shams. The thing is, with the Arab Spring, it taken us all by surprise. The Islamic movements, not least, because it was a sudden change from authoritarian to democracy, and we thought that we are ready because there is a lot of public sentiment with Islam and with the Islamic movements. We misunderstood that to be a mandate to govern democratically, and I think that's where the problem starts. We are in a transition period, moving from authority of 50 years, 60 years, 40 years to a democracy, which was very, very misleading. So the reactions were different in Egypt, in Tunisia, different reactions altogether to this new situation we found ourselves in.
Get to your question,
and,
please, thank you. Get to your question, please.
I don't have a question, just
a comment. Okay.
Just talking along. I can stop at any time. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the first question especially is really an accusation. We haven't really addressed the issue, so maybe we need to get right to that. So whoever wants to go first, Professor, you want to go first? Yeah.
Well, to begin with, you can't answer the question in a single way. You've got a diversity of Islamic movements, and they exist in diverse contexts. So, for example, if you look at Turkey, Turkey accepts the notion of secularism, but uses it in a more inclusive way than the kind of laïc of the past. And so, therefore, you don't see religion involved in terms of, directly influencing key institutions of state. And there is no question about, for example, in Turkey, implementing as a law for the country Sharia. If you look at Tunisia, the Tunisian model that Ennahda put out was to emphasize, rather than political Islam, dominating. It was more, if you will, civil Islam or civic Islam. And then you have, if you actually look, therefore, at that approach, it's a more flexible approach than, for example, than Morsi was open to. I mean, Morsi was willing to adapt, but only up to a point. In a meeting at the UN that I put together for him, with others, put together for him when he was going to the UN with religious leaders from across the country, at one point he kind of quickly mumbled and said, gee, you know, like, I could almost go along with the way the Tunisian definition goes. In fact, even the term secularism, if understood. But what he was really saying is that secularism is much more of a red flag in Egypt than it was in Turkey. So a lot really depends on the movement and in the different context. And I'll just leave it at that. And then later on, if you want to get to the Sharia question, we can do that.
I think I'll start with agreeing with Ashur in the fact that there was a misperception about what was the mandate after the elections, and it is a transitional mandate. And I think one of the mistakes, especially in Egypt, was that Morsi thought it was his mission to just reform the economy of Egypt and change everything and go forward and not just manage the transition until the next election. And that was one of the problems. With regard to the idea of the rule of law, I think that from what I see from the intonation of the question, that you seem to see a contradiction between Sharia and the rule of law. Well, Sharia actually is the epitome of rule of law, as in principle, in the sense that Sharia is supposed to be a body of law which is independent of the people who are. So in the sense, Sharia does not contradict with the rule of law. But you seem to mean by the rule of law something else, which is a kind of also political restraints and some liberalism. I think the whole idea, the whole debate, I think, in the Middle East is not about democracy, and you probably rightly pointed out. It's about liberalism. That the West doesn't want to promote democracy, they want to promote liberalism, and actually people like Farid Zakaria put it quite openly that we shouldn't promote democracy because these are barbarians, and we should have, like Hong Kong, a good governor general to teach them the rule of law and to teach them liberalism, and then when they are ready to become good liberals, then we will allow them to have a little bit of democracy. And so I think that also, if I commented on Jeffrey's point about the authoritarianism, and because he seems to say that in Turkey, for example, the problem is that people think about democracy as just elections. I don't think that that's the idea in Turkey or anywhere else, in the sense that democratization is not also about is not about governance. Morsi, for example, in Egypt, didn't have control over the military, didn't have control of the police, didn't have control of the media, didn't have control of the judiciary. So there are entrenched power centers which themselves need to be democratized. And in Turkey, for example, the media is one power center, which, as I think that the Turkish speaker rightly pointed out, is a power center in itself, together with the military, together with the judiciary. These are established power centers that themselves need to be democratized because they are controlled by minorities. But the point I think which was made is that in Turkey, nobody is arrested as a journalist for differing with the government, because everybody differs with the government. If they wanted to arrest all journalists who disagree with the government, there will be no newspaper or television station. But I think that the final point is about the state. I think the Islamists and most, even I think a lot of academics, do not understand the nature of the state in the Middle East. The nature of the state in the Middle East is not just it's an authoritarian and it's controlled by many power centers like the business, but also the embedded into an international order which is at the moment hegemonic. I mean, people speak about lack of democracy in the Middle East, but for example, when Eastern Europe began to democratize, Russian troops were moving out of Eastern European countries. And so people were democratizing. The same year, Western troops were moving into the Middle East to prop up dictatorships. So, as Joe rightly mentioned, for example, if a government, for example, let's speak about an authoritarian government like Saudi Arabia. When a liberal activist is imprisoned and beaten, the whole world stands up. When in Egypt, hundreds and thousands of people are trampled on and killed, nobody bothers. So there is a context. These states are not standalone. They are within a context. And this context is secular, liberal, bias against the culture of the Middle East. But let's...
If I could ask Jeffery, Professor Haynes to be quick.
I'm only ever quick. I do not know how to be long. The question is kind of predicated on the fact that, on the idea that Islamists can change the state if they choose. And I think that it depends what we mean by the state. The state isn't a synonym for government. The state, in a technical sense, is the institutions that run government. So they have a life of their own. They have a culture of their own. They have a tradition of their own. Very, very difficult to reform states according to the ideological desires of the government of the day. Think of the former Soviet Union and Russia. Think of the continuity that we see there, for example. So I think that the Islamist perception of the state is, in a sense, a red herring. A state is a technical idea that is necessary to run the increasingly complex nature of what governments do. Why would Islamists have a different perception of that than non-Islamists? You've still got to have the technological functions performed by the state, regardless of who's in power. So I don't really see that it's a particularly valid question in terms of ideological preference as to what kind of state we have. States simply endure, and they're very hard to reform. The rule of law issue is very important, and I think it's important to kind of highlight that we hadn't mentioned that. Yes, I think this is one of the key characteristic perhaps, of any viable democratic framework is the fact that unless you have the rule of law, which implies at a basic level that citizens are happy to go out on the streets day and night and don't fear being robbed, stolen from, killed or whatever. Unless you have that perception of security and stability, which the rule of law exemplifies, then you don't have all of the conditions for a democratic framework. But I think the rule of law, the notion of the rule of law, comes from a Western model of consensus, of civic culture, where everybody is agreeing broadly on what that rule of law should look like. When you have a plurality of religions, a plurality of ethnicities perhaps, then the perceptions about what constitutes a viable and appropriate rule of law is not so clear-cut. That's one of the jobs of democracy, is to fashion a framework where people have a modus vivendi, literally a modus vivendi, so they can work together, live together in a framework which the state runs, called the rule of law. It's very difficult to bring it about, and there isn't a great deal of necessary link between a democratization process and a rule of law process. They can be linked, but they're often quite separated. Thank you.
Yeah, if Professor Esposito can answer the specific question about why it's difficult to have rule of law, a democratic rule of law in a society governed by Sharia law. So if you can address that question.
I think at the heart of the problem of even seeing the difficulty is the fact that many Muslims, both scholars and non-scholars, and many non-Muslims, okay, both scholars, non-scholars, and politicians, okay, don't understand at least what I think Sharia is. The conflation of Sharia with the words Islamic law is incorrect. Sharia refers to God's law, divine principles, values as found in the Quran. Islamic law and the corpus of Islamic law, that was a product, okay, of both the divine law and principles, but of interpretation and application. And what that meant is that it was interpreted and applied in an historical and social context, okay? Often including customs that were seen as not being a problem, okay? Therefore, one can then talk about significant reinterpretation. The problem is that your hardline extremists, like hardline people who have a problem with Islam, okay, both opt for this notion that it's all divine law. And therefore they can go back and say, look at that classic tradition. And part of that problem is that when they go to certain aspects of even the Islamic law produced in the past, some of what's there is not to be found in the Quran, for example. So understanding what Sharia is important, because if we don't understand it, then we have all kinds of issues, including in my own country, where you have 29 states that are passing anti-Sharia laws because they're looking and thinking, oh, this must be what Baghdadi wants, or this must be whatever. But it's also a problem because very well-meaning Muslims often conflate the two terms, which then locks into a law in its construction that went back and divinizes all of that, or sacralizes it.
Thank you, Professor. Sadly, we've come to the end of our time. Sorry we didn't have enough time to answer some of your burning questions, but we are past 1:20. I would like everyone to give a warm round of applause to all our speakers.